Welcome to another deep dive with us. This time we're going to be looking at an interesting debate that was sparked by a video that we saw online.
Yeah, this should be a fun one.
This video was a popular atheist commentator, Alex, going up against 25 theists.
Wow, 25? That's a lot.
Yeah, 25 theists.
Okay.
So this debate got into some classic theological issues and dilemmas like genocide, slavery, and free will, particularly focusing on the biblical story of Noah's Ark and the Great Flood.
Yeah, so we've got some interesting source material for this deep dive.
Yeah, so the source material that we're going to be using is a collection of comments from an online discussion about this debate, giving us a really wide range of perspectives and a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, the story of Noah's Ark and the flood has been a topic of discussion and debate for centuries.
Right.
And, I think these online comments are a really interesting window into how relevant these questions still are today.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a pretty heated discussion, I have to say.
Oh,
Full of wit, passion, and some pretty in-depth dives into the philosophical side of things.
I love that.
And one commenter in particular stood out to us.
Okay.
Her name is Kitani.
Okay.
And she had some really thought-provoking challenges and comments in the discussion.
Yeah, you're right. She really does make some interesting points.
In fact, one commenter even referred to her as Alex's, like, intellectual equal in this whole thing.
Oh, wow.
So during this deep dive, we're going to be analyzing the different arguments that are presented, exploring, the strengths and weaknesses of each, and trying to get to the core of what the main participants, especially Kitani, believe. And we'll also be looking at how logic, faith, and personal beliefs all intertwine in this discussion.
Sounds good. Let's get into it.
So to set the stage, Kitani seemed really excited for this debate.
Okay.
She even mentioned in the comment that she was looking forward to it after enjoying Destiny's debate against the Mad J crowd.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
And to set the stage, this is Alex going up against 25 theists, so it's bound to be a pretty lively discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kitani jumped right into the heart of the matter.
Okay.
She brought up the genocide of the Canaanites as described in the Old Testament.
Right.
And she pointed out that even very prominent Christian apologists, people like Dinesh D'Souza and William Lane Craig, have struggled to defend it.
Yeah, and she specifically said, I am genuinely curious how the genocide of the Canaanites will be defended.
Right.
Even top apologists like Dinesh D'Souza and William Lane Craig struggle to defend that.
Yeah, it's a really good example of a biblical event that raises some pretty serious moral questions, even for, people who consider themselves to be devout.
Yeah, for sure. And this kind of leads Kitani to then question the morality of the flood itself, which is really the main focus of the entire debate.
Right, and she poses this very, very powerful question.
Okay.
She says, if God is all-knowing and all-powerful, why drown everyone, including innocent infants, in the flood?
Whoa.
Where's the justice in that?
Heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And of course, there's going to be some pushback to that.
Yeah.
Another commenter, Lukai54CZ, argued that everyone, even infants, inherited this evil, so to speak, because of Adam and Eve's original sin.
Right.
And therefore weren't truly innocent and deserved punishment.
He's bringing up the idea of original sin here,
right,
which has been a subject of theological debate for centuries. Yeah.
Yeah, and it raises this interesting question about, collective punishment versus individual responsibility.
Right. So just to punish somebody for something that they've inherited.
Exactly.
Something they had no control over.
Right. And Kitani does not let this argument slide.
No.
She goes on to argue that blaming infants for something that they've inherited, something that's totally out of their control, is essentially just collective punishment.
Right.
And she says, would a truly moral being punish someone for simply existing?
That's a really good question. It really kind of makes us examine our own beliefs about fairness, justice, and what it means to be responsible for our own actions.
For sure. And it's at this point where the discussion takes a very fascinating turn into the concept of free will.
Oh, here we go.
Kitani argues that if God is all-knowing, he knew that Adam and Eve would sin.
Right.
So did he essentially set them up to fail?
Yeah.
Did he create them predisposed to sin, meaning that free will is just an illusion?
So she's tapping into the age-old debate of determinism versus free will, right? A concept that's just puzzled philosophers and theologians for centuries.
Think of it like dominoes. God tips the first domino, knowing exactly where each one will fall. Does that mean we really have no choice in the matter?
Right.
Or can we choose our own path, even within a larger plan that's already laid out?
It's a tough question. It's a complex question.
Absolutely. And Lukashav84CZ jumps back into the debate, arguing that, quote, we have free will.
Okay.
God is not forcing us to do anything against our will.
Okay, so she believes in free will.
Right. But Kitani challenges that with another interesting question, saying, can you freely choose to change your desires? Like, could you suddenly decide to be attracted to something that you currently find completely unappealing?
That's a really good point. It makes us examine, like, the depths of our own consciousness and, like, how much control we actually have over our thoughts.
Right. Our desires and our actions.
Yeah.
It gets at the heart of personal agency.
Sure.
If we can't even choose what we desire, are we truly free?
Right.
And does believing in free will actually change how we live our lives?
Absolutely. Raises some really interesting questions about our perception of choice and how that influences our actions.
And this back and forth between Kitani and Lukashav4CZ gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because at one point, Luka54CZ brings up this idea that God allows suffering for a greater purpose.
Okay.
Even arguing that suffering that we experience here on Earth pales in comparison to the eternal bliss of heaven.
Right. Classic theodicy.
Kitani, however, really pushes back on this.
Yeah.
Saying, and I quote, what kind of greater good requires infants to suffer? You haven't justified that. All you've done is state that it's the case. You haven't said why a morally perfect being would allow, much less cause infants to burn in hell for all eternity.
Strong words.
Yeah, she's really challenging the traditional theistic perspective here, pointing out that simply saying that suffering serves a greater good doesn't actually justify it.
Right.
Especially when it involves innocent beings like infants.
And that leads us perfectly into the classic philosophical dilemma.
Oh, here we go.
The problem of evil. If God is all good and all powerful, why does evil exist in the world?
It's a question that has challenged thinkers really since like the dawn of time.
For sure.
And Kitani lays out a very concise argument in the form of a logical syllogism.
Yeah.
She argues that if free will leads to evil, and God gave us free will, then God is ultimately responsible for evil.
Okay, that's a tough one to argue against.
Absolutely. And another commenter, Peter, attempts to offer a counterpoint, suggesting that humans are responsible for their actions, not God.
Right.
He states, quote, it is not God, but humans who do evil.
So Peter is really emphasizing individual accountability here, suggesting we have the power to choose between good and evil and must take responsibility for the consequences of our choices.
But again, Kitani pushes back, saying that if God created us with the capacity for evil, isn't he ultimately the root cause?
Right.
She even asks Peter directly, if I program a computer to inevitably output an evil outcome, am I not the one who made it do evil things?
Ooh, that's a good analogy.
Right. It raises this question of whether a creator can truly be absolved of responsibility for the actions of their creation.
Right.
Especially if that creation was designed with the potential for evil.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and it kind of turns into this philosophical tug of war.
It does.
With each of them pulling on different threads of the argument.
It really does. It's fascinating to watch it unfold in these comments, and I think it really highlights this complex interplay between faith, reason, and how we understand good and evil.
Absolutely, and we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, we are just getting started.
So stay tuned as we continue to delve deeper into this fascinating discussion, exploring the nuances of each argument and unpacking the implications of the Great Flood on how we view morality, free will, and the nature of belief itself.
I'm excited to keep going.
Me too. Welcome back to our deep dive into the morality of the Great Flood. Before we move on, I think it's important to take a step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, we've been focusing on like this specific arguments about the flood and free will and the problem of evil.
Right.
But what does this all mean in a broader context?
Right. One of the things that's so fascinating about this whole discussion is that it touches on some of the most like fundamental questions that humans have grappled with for centuries.
Right.
The nature of good and evil, the existence of suffering, the role of free will, and the limits of human understanding.
These are questions that have been debated by philosophers and theologians for millennia.
Right.
And it's so interesting to see how those same questions are still relevant and hotly contested today, even in the context of like an online discussion.
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to the enduring power of these questions, you know?
Yeah.
They're not just these abstract intellectual puzzles. They're questions that have a real impact on how we live our lives, how we make sense of the world, and how we relate to one another.
So true. And in this debate, we see those questions playing out in a very real and personal way.
Yes, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there's no one right answer to these questions.
Of course.
Different people are going to come to different conclusions based on their own experiences, beliefs, and values.
And that's okay.
Right.
In fact, I think that's what makes this discussion so rich and engaging.
Totally.
It's not about finding a definitive answer,
right,
but rather about exploring different perspectives, challenging our own assumptions, and deepening our understanding of these complex issues.
I completely agree. So as we continue to unpack these various arguments, I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Okay.
We're not trying to judge who's right or wrong,
Right.
but rather to understand the different perspectives at play and how they contribute to this larger ongoing conversation about the human condition.
That's a great point. And speaking of understanding different perspectives, I'm really intrigued by how this debate has sparked a conversation about the nature of morality itself.
Me too. It's been particularly interesting to see how Kitani challenges the idea that morality is solely dictated by God.
Yeah, you're right. There's this really fascinating exchange where Lukács 5:4 is laying out his definition of sin.
Okay.
Describing it as an utterance, deed, or desire that goes against God's will.
Yeah.
And he actually quotes the Catechism of the Catholic Church saying,
oh, wow.
quote, "Sin is an offense against reason, truth, and right conscience. It is failure in genuine love for God and neighbor caused by a perverse attachment to certain goods. It wounds the nature of man and injures human solidarity. It has been defined as an utterance, a deed, or a desire contrary to the eternal law."
So he's going right to the source.
Absolutely. And Kitani jumps in with a really thought-provoking question.
Yeah.
She asks, why is it wrong to offend God? Is it only wrong because he's powerful? Or is it wrong because he's right? If it's the former, then there's nothing intrinsically wrong with sinning so long as you don't get caught.
Yeah.
If it's the latter, then you're admitting that there's a standard of morality that exists independent of God's opinion.
That's a really powerful point.
Right.
She's essentially arguing that if morality is simply whatever God says it is, then it's ultimately arbitrary.
Exactly. And that raises the question of whether morality is objective, meaning it exists independently of human opinion,
right,
or subjective, meaning it's based on individual or cultural perspectives.
It's a deep philosophical rabbit hole.
It is.
And I love how Kitani's not afraid to just dive right in.
Oh, she is fearless. She is not afraid.
And this line of questioning challenges traditional theistic beliefs in a really interesting way.
Absolutely.
If morality isn't grounded in something absolute like the will of God, then what is it based on?
Right.
And how do we determine what's truly right and wrong?
Makes your head spin a little bit.
It really does.
I have to say, I am so impressed by Kitani's ability to articulate these complex philosophical concepts in such a clear and concise way.
Me too. She doesn't shy away from the nuance of these arguments, but she also manages to make them accessible and engaging.
Yeah.
Even for those who might not have a background in philosophy or theology.
For sure. And I think her contributions to this debate really highlight the importance of critical thinking.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to examining our own beliefs.
Right.
She encourages us to question assumptions.
Right.
To look for logical inconsistencies.
Yeah.
And to be open to different perspectives.
That's a valuable lesson to take away from any discussion, especially one that deals with such weighty topics as the morality of the Great Flood and the nature of good and evil.
Speaking of the Great Flood, I want to go back to that logical syllogism that Kitani presented about the problem of evil.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
If free will leads to evil and God gave us free will, then God is ultimately responsible for evil.
Yes, I remember that it was very compelling.
Right, and as you might expect, that argument generated a lot of pushback from other commenters.
Of course, it's a direct challenge to the traditional theistic view of God's role in the world.
One commenter, Peter, responded to Kitani's syllogism by questioning her premise that God is responsible for the evil actions of human beings.
Okay.
He argued that human beings have to take responsibility for their own choices, regardless of whether or not God gave them free will.
Right.
He stated, quote, "Eventually, human beings have to take responsibility for their own actions. This means that it is not God, but humans who do the evil."
So it's a classic defense of free will.
Yeah.
He's essentially saying that we have a genuine choice between good and evil. Right.
And we can't blame God for the choices that we make.
But Kitani doesn't let him off that easily.
Oh, no.
She pushes back, saying that this idea that humans must take responsibility isn't some universal truth,
Interesting.
but rather a social construct that we've developed for practical reasons.
That's an interesting angle.
Right.
It suggests that our concepts of morality and responsibility aren't necessarily objective,
Yeah.
but rather products of our social and cultural evolution.
Exactly. And she takes it a step further, pointing out that the whole concept of sin is based on the idea that we're disobeying God's will.
Right.
She says, quote, "If there is no God, then there is no sin. If there is no sin, then there is no need for forgiveness, salvation, or any of the other things that Christianity is predicated upon."
So she's really challenging the foundations of the Christian belief system here.
Yeah.
She's essentially saying that if you remove God from the equation, the whole concept of morality, as defined by Christianity, collapses.
It's a bold statement.
It is.
And it really gets to the heart of the debate between faith and reason. Right. If we can't rely on God to tell us what's right and wrong,
Right.
then how do we determine our moral compass?
Right.
Do we rely on reason, intuition, empathy, or something else entirely?
It's a question with no easy answers.
Not at all.
But I think Kitani's point is that we shouldn't shy away from these difficult questions,
Right.
even if they challenge our deeply held beliefs.
And I think that's a valuable takeaway from this whole discussion.
Yeah.
It's okay to question, to doubt, and to wrestle with these complex issues.
Right.
In fact, that's often how we arrive at a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
I totally agree. And speaking of wrestling with complex issues, there's another really interesting exchange between Kitani and Peter that I wanted to bring up.
Okay.
It gets into the heart of the problem of evil.
Oh, yes. This is where Kitani really puts Peter on the spot.
She does. She asks him directly, quote, "Please don't take it the wrong way, because it is a genuine question. You seek to demonstrate the inconsistency and untruth of the way in which Christianity deals with the problem of evil. Ignoring for the moment differences within the numerous Christian denominations themselves, but would you be able to provide me with logical and consistent explanation of the existence of evil?"
That is such a direct and challenging question.
It is.
It forces Peter to confront the inherent difficulty of reconciling the existence of evil with the belief in a benevolent and all-powerful God.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that Peter doesn't try to dodge the question
He doesn't.
or offer some, pat answer.
Wow.
He's surprisingly candid in his response.
He is. What does he say?
Well, he admits quite honestly that he doesn't know why evil exists.
Wow.
He says, and I'm quoting here, "I don't know why there is evil. All I know is that there is one God who is good, who cannot will evil, who cannot create anything evil, and from whom nothing evil can emanate."
That's a very honest and humble response.
Right.
It acknowledges the limits of human understanding when it comes to these really profound questions.
I agree, and I think it speaks to Peter's intellectual integrity.
Yeah.
He's willing to admit that he doesn't have all the answers, which is something we could all learn from.
Absolutely. But of course, Kitani, being Kitani, doesn't just leave it at that.
Of course not.
What does she say?
She points out that if God created everything
Right.
and evil exists, then logically God must have created evil.
Right. She's highlighting the inherent contradiction in Peter's belief system.
Exactly. And she goes on to suggest that maybe a better explanation for the existence of evil lies in the very structure of the universe itself,
Okay.
rather than the will of a benevolent God.
Interesting.
She proposes that evil might be like an emergent property
Okay.
of the complex interplay of physical laws and human choices.
That's a fascinating idea.
It is.
It suggests that evil isn't something that was intentionally created,
Right.
but rather something that arose as a byproduct of the way the universe works.
It's a thought-provoking alternative to the traditional theistic view.
It is.
And it opens up a whole new avenue inquiry into the nature of good and evil.
This whole exchange between Kitani and Peter is so rich with insight and complexity.
Oh, absolutely.
It really showcases the power of respectful dialogue,
Yeah.
even when there are strongly held differences of opinion.
And it demonstrates that sometimes the most honest and insightful answers are the ones that acknowledge the limits of our knowledge and the enduring mystery of existence.
Well said. And as we continue our deep dive into this fascinating debate, I'm eager to see what other insights and challenges emerge from this online discussion.
Stay with us. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been unpacking this incredibly thought-provoking debate about the morality of the Great Flood, and it seems like every layer we peel back just reveals even more complexity.
You're absolutely right. It's like we're on an archaeological dig, uncovering these fascinating artifacts and piecing together a larger picture of how humans grapple with these timeless questions of faith, reason, and the very nature of existence.
And speaking of uncovering fascinating artifacts, I want to bring up another intriguing thread in this conversation that touches on the concept of sin.
Okay.
Remember we talked about Luca Sciaffassi's definition of sin as an utterance, deed, or desire that goes against God's will.
Yeah.
But this discussion goes beyond just defining sin. It delves into how different people interpret what it means to sin.
You're right. There's this really insightful exchange between Luca Sciaffa and another commenter, Peter,
Right.
where they discuss the different types of sin and their implications.
Okay.
Luca Sciaffa brings up the concept of mortal sin, which he defines as a grave violation of God's law that destroys charity in the heart of man by a grave violation of God's law. It turns man away from God, who is his ultimate end, and at the same time, it turns him toward his own destruction by depriving him of the supernatural state necessary for eternal life.
Okay.
He goes on to say that a mortal sin can only be forgiven through the sacrament of reconciliation.
That sounds pretty intense.
It is.
So, according to Luca Sciaffa, there are actions so serious that they completely sever your connection with God.
Right.
And only a specific ritual can repair that damage.
That's the essence of the Catholic doctrine on mortal sin.
Right.
But Peter, while agreeing that some sins are certainly more grave than others,
Okay.
questions whether any sin can truly be unforgivable,
Okay.
especially if someone genuinely repents.
Okay.
He argues that God's mercy is infinite and that even the most grievous sin can be forgiven if the person turns back to God with a sincere heart.
So we see a bit of a divergence here in how these two commenters interpret the severity and consequences of sin.
Right.
One emphasizes the absolute nature of certain transgressions, while the other emphasizes the power of repentance and divine mercy.
It's a fascinating contrast, and it really highlights how, even within a single religion, there can be a spectrum of interpretations when it comes to complex theological concepts like sin and forgiveness.
And this difference in interpretation also ties back to the debate about free will.
Right.
If we have true freedom to choose our actions, then the concept of sin becomes even more weighty, because we're making those choices knowing they have consequences.
Right.
But if our actions are predetermined or influenced by factors beyond our control, then does the concept of sin even make sense?
It's a tangled web, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this complexity is further highlighted when another commenter, Rainbow Reaper, jumps into the conversation and throws a bit of a wrench into the traditional theistic arguments.
Okay.
Remember we talked about how some theists justify God's lack of intervention in human affairs by saying it's because he respects our free will?
Yes, that was a key point in the debate. God gave us the power to choose. So he has to let us make our own choices, even if they lead to suffering.
Right. But Rainbow Reaper challenges that logic by pointing to the Great Flood itself.
Okay.
If God truly doesn't interfere with human free will, then why did he intervene so dramatically with the flood, essentially wiping out almost all of humanity?
That's a great point.
Right.
It's like he's saying, okay, so God respects free will, except when he doesn't.
Exactly. And this apparent contradiction really highlights the difficulty of reconciling the concept of divine intervention with the idea of human free will.
So how do the other commenters address this challenge?
Well, Lucas 54CZ responds by arguing that the people who perished in the flood had a choice.
Okay.
They could have heeded Noah's warnings and repented, but they chose not to.
Okay.
He states, God gave them plenty of warning. They chose to ignore it. They are responsible for their own choices.
So it's back to the idea of personal responsibility, even in the face of divine judgment.
Right.
God gave them a chance, and they made their bed, so to speak.
That's the essence of his argument, but Rainbow Reaper isn't convinced.
Okay.
He argues that by causing the flood, God essentially took away people's free will.
Right.
They no longer had the option to continue living their lives and potentially making different choices later on.
It's a thought-provoking counterpoint.
It is.
It suggests that free will isn't just about making a choice at a specific moment in time,
Right.
but also about having the opportunity to change and grow over time.
Right. And that opens up a whole other can of worms.
Oh, boy.
If God knows everything that's going to happen, does that mean our choices are already predetermined? Or do we have genuine freedom to change our minds as we move through life?
It's a mind-bending question that really highlights the limits of human understanding when it comes to divine knowledge and the nature of time.
For sure.
But I think it's a testament to the intellectual depth of this online discussion that these sorts of questions are even being raised.
I completely agree. And it's not just the heavy philosophical stuff that gets explored either.
Okay.
The conversation also touches on some more specific theological concepts like the nature of hell and the possibility of redemption.
Oh, I remember this part. It gets pretty intense.
It does.
Some commenters, like Peter, suggests that hell might not be a literal place of fire and brimstone,
Okay.
but rather a state of separation from God.
Interesting.
He sees it as a spiritual condition rather than a physical punishment.
And that view resonates with another commenter, Leo, who expresses discomfort with the traditional image of an all-loving God sending people to eternal torture.
Yeah.
He proposes that a more compassionate view of hell would be a place of purification or reformation where souls have a chance to grow and learn from their mistakes.
That's a really interesting interpretation.
It is.
It shifts the focus from punishment to growth and healing,
Right.
which aligns with a more merciful understanding of God's nature.
But of course, there are other commenters who hold a more traditional view of hell as a place of eternal damnation for those who have rejected God's grace.
Right.
Luke 5:4cz, for example, sticks to the Catholic doctrine on this matter.
It's fascinating to see how people's interpretations of hell are so deeply intertwined with their beliefs about God's nature and the purpose of human existence.
Absolutely.
Do we believe in a God who is primarily about justice and punishment?
Right.
Or do we believe in a God who is primarily about love, mercy, and redemption?
That's the core question that drives these different interpretations, and it's a question that each individual has to answer for themselves based on their own beliefs and experiences.
So after all this deep diving, where does this leave us? We've explored so many facets of this debate.
We have.
The morality of the flood, the limits of free will, the nature of sin, the varying interpretations of hell. It's been quite a journey.
It really has, and I think one of the most important takeaways from this whole discussion is that there are no easy answers to these questions.
Right.
These are age-old dilemmas that have challenged thinkers for centuries.
Right.
And there's no single right way to understand them.
That's a great point, and I think it's important to remember that the value of this discussion isn't necessarily about arriving at a definitive conclusion.
Right.
It's about the process of exploration, the challenging of assumptions,
Right.
and the willingness to engage in respectful dialogue, even when there are deep differences of opinion.
Absolutely, and I think Kitani, Lukasha 4CZ, Peter, and all the other commenters in this discussion deserve credit for their willingness to engage with these complex issues in such a thoughtful and articulate way.
I agree. They've given us a lot to think about.
They have.
And they've shown us the power of civil discourse, even when it comes to topics that can be deeply personal and emotionally charged.
Well said. So to our listeners, we invite you to continue pondering these questions.
Yes.
What resonated with you the most? Where do you stand on the debate about the morality of the flood, the limits of free will, and the nature of good and evil? What further questions does this spark for you? Keep those neurons firing. That's what makes life and learning so fascinating.